We are following the latest developments in Syria, where Russia is blaming Israel for bombing a regime military base. Now, it's unclear if this latest strike was related to the alleged chemical attack over the weekend. The Syrian government is accused of using chlorine gas on rebels outside of Damascus in the town of Douma. Dozens were killed and over 500 people were rushed to medical centers with breathing problems. President Trump vowed to respond, saying there would be a big price to pay. For more on this now, I want to bring in Ambassador Robert Ford. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, and he's now a senior fellow at Yale University and at the Middle East Institute. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador. So listen, if it's confirmed that this turns out to be a chemical attack, what should President Trump do? We saw his tweet over the weekend where he said, there'll be a big price to pay. This comes a year after a military strike because of what appears to be a similar chemical attack. Should a military strike be the option?
Well, I think a military strike is the only way to deter Bashar al-Assad's government from using chemical weapons again. They use chemical weapons regularly. I think we should also understand that deterring the use of chemical weapons is not going to change the Syrian civil war. It's not going to remove Bashar al-Assad from power.
Did last year's military strike after a chemical attack, did that make a difference?
It did for a time. For some months, Bashar al-Assad refrained from using chemical weapons, but because it was a one-time American strike, and after Assad began using chemical weapons again, and the Trump administration did not react, Assad kept testing the edge of the envelope, kept testing. The only way to deter his use is to do strikes, painful strikes, each time he uses chemical weapons, so that he finally begins to think twice and think even 3 times before using chemical weapons in the prosecution of his war machine. So
this alleged chemical attack comes days after the whole world heard the president say, we're going to be out of Syria soon. U.S. troops will be out of Syria. ISIS is basically under control, and then we'll let everyone else take care of what's left. How important is an American presence in Syria, even, in terms of if ISIS is under control, if you want to believe that, and that the U.S. can actually move out of Syria, after that point, how important is it to have an American presence there, or can America afford to be hands-off?
I don't think we have any huge interests in the part of Syria where the American forces are stationed. They're way out in the deserts of eastern Syria, just near the Iraqi border, actually. They could, if they're out there, they could help prevent ISIS from reemerging for a time, but they do nothing to prevent ISIS from reemerging in other parts of Syria where there are no American forces. And frankly, leaving them there risks dragging us into the broader Syrian civil war. We're already being dragged into it. Our guns are now pointed at Turkey. We've bombed Russian and Syrian government forces about the control of an oil and gas field. Those things have nothing to do with ISIS. So we're already on a slippery slope, and I don't think that's really where we want to be in the broad, complicated Syrian civil war.
So you agree with the president that perhaps the time is near in which American troops will be scaled back?
I think the president is wise to ask his national security advisors for a strategy that enables us to leave northeastern Syria. I mean, let me put it this way. How many Americans know where Hasakeh is? How many Americans know where Kobani is? How many Americans know where Deir ez-Zor is? Are those places that are really vital to American long-term national security interests? I don't think so. They weren't identified as such when I was the American ambassador in Syria.
So, if we do sort of pull out, if that's the strategy moving forward, how does President Trump's long-term policy differ from that of President Obama's then?
There are some similarities between Obama and Trump. Most notably, neither man wanted to get the United States deeply involved in the civil wars raging in the Middle East. Obama was very careful not to get involved in the Syrian civil war. We could even say that his failure to do a little bit in 2012 and 13 ended up getting our troops sent in 2015 and 16. Trump also is reluctant to get deeply involved in the Syrian civil war. I think he has an instinctive sense that there are a lot of players on the ground. There are a lot of states already involved in that civil war, and it's not something we control, and therefore we need to be very careful. I think he is smart to be cautious about this, and I have yet to hear the national security team around the president enunciate a strategy, enunciate benchmarks, or enunciate a timeline for how to go forward.
Do you think that the president's tweet over the weekend when he said there'll be a big price to pay was similar to the red line in the sand phrase from President Obama, that when he says there'll be a big price to pay, he's got to do something?
Well, I don't think we ever should use American forces just to show we can do something. I think we need to identify an interest before we ever use American military forces. I think it's important to deter the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Other countries, Sudan, are now starting to use chemical weapons in some instances. We have the North Korean problem to worry about. Would they use chemical weapons? So it's not because of a tweet that I think we should be considering the use of U.S. military force to deter chemical weapons. I think there's an American national security interest involved.
And let me ask you about this airstrike on a Syrian military base. Russia is now blaming Israel for this airstrike. Why would Russia be doing that?
Well, I think it's fairly clear that it was the Israelis who struck the airbase, and the Israelis struck the same airbase in February, so it's not the first time they've done that. The airbase is used by the Iranians for some of their logistical work in Syria. I think the Russians are also doing it as a way of sending a message to the Israelis that Russia stood by this time, but may not stand by every time.
Finally, Ambassador, the UN Security Council, they're going to be holding an emergency meeting about Syria. Realistically, what can the UN do?
The UN can't do anything. The Security Council is subject to vetoes from any of the 5 permanent members, including the United States, including Russia, including China. The Russians have vetoed 17 resolutions about Syria since 2012. 17. If the United States pushes hard for UN action, we will probably see Russian veto number 18.
Ambassador Robert Ford, thank you so much for talking with us.